markers. Honestly, they didn't contribute anything unique from each other. I would probably only use one in the future. We did a field blank before the first and last site each day, which is probably a more typical amount of blanks to take. All right, data. So this is showing you the two different molecular markers in the beige and the green. Again, they end up being functionally the same thing. This is showing you copies per liter or concentrations of estimated concentrations of eel DNA. And the circles, of course, are proportionally sized to the quantity of DNA. It kind of looks like maybe what you would have expected, right? I mean, we lose, I'll say about, if you take all the data sets together, we lose about 80% of our DNA signature above each respective barrier. So in the estuary, we are red hot. Above the federal dam, we lose a bunch, but we're still pretty hot. Above Fourth Branch Dam, we lose more. Above New York State Dam, we're getting really lean, and we don't have a single detection upstream of the Hose Falls during the spring data set, with the exception of one PCR rep positive on Lasher Creek, which is about halfway up the watershed, I want to say, in maybe the Frankfurt area, if I'm not mistaken, a single PCR rep positive. Now, let's pull in the summer data. All the same information, laid out the same way. Concentrations are lower across the board. That's the first interesting finding here. Does that reflect, spring movement of eels versus a more static period in the summer? Maybe. But the story is still the same, right? We still lose probably just under an order of magnitude above each successive barrier. In this instance, we actually do have a weak positive up here below the Crescent Dam and a very weak positive below the Vischer Ferry and Lock 7 Dam as well. I'm showing you this just to prove that we did it. We did actually take the model and try to convert these concentrations into estimated densities of eels. This is log scaled, so if you actually look at what these confidence intervals are showing you, this is slightly more useful than nothing, but not much. I mean, just because they are such wide ranges, and we'll talk about potentially why the limitations of some of this work and why that is the case in a moment. So, first I'm going to tell you why it's bad, and then I'll tell you why it's decent. I think this was a good first step, but it has two huge shortcomings. First, we have failed to incorporate the role of discharge into this, right? We built this model on tribs to the Hudson that were relatively small, and now we're using it to estimate eel densities on the Mohawk, which, again, in some cases we're using it on Mohawk tribs, which might be of comparable size, but if we're on the main stem of the Mohawk, it's not comparable size. And you can imagine if you have 100 eels in a small stream and 100 eels in a large river, and they're sloughing DNA at the same rate, the concentration you're going to observe in those two water samples are going to be very different because of dilution. We had planned to account for this. We took a lot of discharge measurements as part of this project, and it really unraveled when we got into phase 2. And how do you take discharge like inside the Waterford flight, right? I mean, when the water's not really moving, and it really started to unravel when we got into some of these highly regulated sections where, depending on what the hydro facility is doing, discharge is fluctuating rapidly. And this would have been very easy in a completely natural, unregulated system, but that's not life. So we need to figure out a better way to deal with this in the future because our data, I think, is negatively affected by this at the moment. And secondly, we need more data. We need more temporal replicates because we've seen in some recent work in 2023 where you can just take eDNA samples rapid fire and the concentrations just up and down, and that's either because the DNA is just heterogeneously distributed or because there's enough slop in the lab methods during the extraction and amplification, but that really needs to get quantified too to do this better. Anyway, despite those limitations, there was still value here. Looks like DNA concentration worked okay to predict density. Also worked for biomass, but with a little bit less precision. 100-meter reaches for electrofishing were not long enough, but some of these are 8-10 hour surveys, as they were, so it's, manpower limits. If you take one thing from this talk, I hope it's either this bullet or the next. We see our DNA concentration reduced by approximately 80% above each successive barrier. That varied widely depending on whether it was the spring or summer survey and which barrier you were at, so this is just kind of an average, but this is eerily similar to a paper looking at Hudson River tribs that Karin and others were a part of, which I believe found about an order of magnitude or 90% reduction in actual captures of eels above barriers in the Hudson trib. So given the limitations here, which I think impact our ability to make a precise estimate, 80% versus 90%, I mean, I'd say they're functionally the same thing, at least as I feel about it. So this was very interesting to see that we landed in the same ballpark as that prior work. Another take-home message doesn't feel too great. I mean, eel DNA is almost undetectable upstream of Crescent Dam and the Waterford Flight of Lock. So this is the majority of the Mohawk watershed, right? And not to say it's not there, but it's at such low concentrations we can barely occasionally detect it. So if you just strictly do an exercise calculating watershed area, I mean, this tells you that over 99% of the Mohawk River watershed is largely inaccessible to eels. I mean, there's a few up there, but I mean, by and large, not really. So you could spin this around and reach the conclusion, which again, probably is not an earth-shattering statement, that if you're trying to improve eel access into the Mohawk watershed, you really need to focus on the downstream most barriers, right? I mean, if you lose 80% 3 times in a row, you could start with something just shy of infinity and you cut it down by 80% 3 times in a row, you don't have much left, right? So, improving passage further upstream, I mean, is still an excellent goal, of course, for a variety of reasons, but you're not gonna, there'd be no reason to expect major gains in eel restoration until the downstream most barriers, have improved passage. If you're interested in diving into this further, obviously I'm always happy to chat, but we did publish this in Transactions of the American Fisheries Society, shown here, and all of the data are in a USGS data release, not just the eDNA data, but also the electrofishing data from the Hudson tribs. So our interest was not in the Hudson River estuary and tribs, right? We just use that to build our tool, but for folks who do eel research in the estuary, there's lengths and weights on, I don't know, a couple thousand individual eels from that effort, so obviously take advantage if that's useful to you. Just want to do a few acknowledgments. Chris Reese and Meredith Bartron at the Fish and Wildlife Service have just been awesome genetic partners to do this work with. I need to acknowledge Mohawk River Basin Program for their role supporting this through DEC. And I also want to acknowledge both Karin and Chris Bowser did really awesome reviews on the manuscript that improved it considerably to help get it to the finish line. So with that, I am happy to field any questions.